The encounter at the park. It was a sunny afternoon when Mark, a man in a wheelchair, decided to visit the park. He had been feeling lonely lately, and the fresh air always made him feel a little better. He rolled slowly along the path, watching the people around him. Some were jogging, others were walking their dogs, and some were simply enjoying the warmth of the sun. Mark didn't mind the quiet. It was peaceful, and for a while, he could forget about the challenges he faced every day. As he approached the bench near the fountain, he noticed a woman sitting there, talking to her friends. She looked like she was enjoying the day, but her laughter was loud and mocking. Mark didn't pay much attention at first. He was used to the occasional rude stare or whisper behind his back. People often assumed that because he was in a wheelchair, he had nothing important to offer. But then, as he neared the bench, he overheard the woman, Karen, making a cruel joke. "Look at that poor guy in the wheelchair," she said, laughing. "I bet he doesn't even have a job. Just sitting there, waiting for people to feel sorry for him." Mark's heart sank for a moment. He was used to people treating him like he was invisible or less than. But hearing Karen's words stung more than he expected. He had worked so hard to get where he was in life, despite the obstacles his disability had thrown in his path. Yet here was someone mocking him simply because of how he appeared. Karen continued, "What a sad life. He probably needs handouts to survive. Someone should tell him to get a job and stop begging for attention." Her friends laughed along with her, not realizing how hurtful her words were. Mark's face remained calm, but inside, his thoughts raced. He could hear every word she said, but he didn't respond. He knew better than to let people like her get to him. Instead, he rolled past the bench slowly, trying to stay composed. As he passed, he noticed Karen glance at him with a look of complete disdain. Her smile was still on her face, but there was something in her eyes, something that told Mark she truly believed what she said. She thought he was just another disabled person, someone to be pitied and mocked. She had no idea who he really was. Mark didn't let it show, but he was angry. Not at her, but at the way people like her judged him without knowing anything about him. He had been through so much in his life. Years of surgeries, struggles, and pain. Yet he had built a life for himself that most people could only dream of. And yet here was Karen, laughing at him as if he were nothing more than a helpless beggar. He rolled past the bench, taking a deep breath to calm himself. He knew he couldn't let her words get to him. He had learned long ago that people like Karen were everywhere. But what they didn't know was that Mark wasn't just any man in a wheelchair. As Mark reached the edge of the park, he spotted his driver waiting by a sleek black car. It was a stark contrast to the wheelchair he was in, but it was his car, and it was his choice. He wheeled himself up to the car, and his driver, a tall man named John, opened the door for him. "Everything all right, Mr. Mark?" John asked, as he helped Mark into the car. Mark nodded, his mind still on the cruel words Karen had said. "Just another day," he replied, with a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Let's head to the office." As the car pulled away from the park, Mark glanced back through the rear window, his thoughts still on the woman who had mocked him. He wondered if she would ever realize how wrong she was about him. But then he remembered something else. Mark wasn't just any ordinary man. Despite his disability, he had built an empire from the ground up. He wasn't a beggar. He wasn't someone who needed anyone's pity. He was Mark Taylor, a self-made billionaire, and he had worked harder than most people could imagine to get where he was today. Karen had no idea who he was. She had no idea that the man she had laughed at had the power to change the world. He had worked tirelessly to build his businesses, to prove to the world that a disability didn't define a person's worth. His wheelchair didn't stop him from becoming one of the richest men in the world. But Mark didn't feel the need to boast about his wealth or his achievements. He was content to let people underestimate him. It was their mistake. He had always believed that the best way to silence a critic was to show them that they were wrong. And that was exactly what he planned to do with Karen. As the car drove away, Mark's eyes narrowed slightly. He knew that someday Karen would come face to face with the truth, but for now, he would let her continue living in her world of assumptions and ignorance. Mark smiled to himself. Life had a funny way of teaching people lessons, and Karen was about to learn a very important one. The unexpected meeting. A few days passed since the encounter at the park, and Mark couldn't shake the memory of the cruel words Karen had said. Though he had tried to push it out of his mind, a part of him still felt angered by how easily she had judged him. But Mark was determined not to let it affect him. After all, he had bigger things to focus on. As a billionaire, he had more than enough to worry about with his business ventures. But that afternoon, as he walked into his office building, something strange happened. His assistant, Lisa, rushed up to him with an urgent look on her face. "Mr. Taylor," she said, her voice filled with concern. "There's someone here to see you. She insists on meeting with you right away." Mark raised an eyebrow, puzzled. "Who is it?" "She says her name is Karen. Karen Foster." Mark's heart skipped a beat. Karen, the woman from the park, the one who had mocked him without knowing who he really was. "Send her in," Mark said calmly, masking his surprise. He had learned to stay composed in unexpected situations, but he couldn't deny that a part of him was intrigued. Why was she here? A few moments later, Karen walked into his office. She seemed different from the woman he had seen at the park. Gone was the confidence that had made her laugh at him so easily. Instead, she looked nervous and uncomfortable as she hesitated in the doorway. "Mr. Taylor," she began, her voice wavering slightly. I owe you an apology." Mark stood up from his desk and gestured for her to sit. "Please, have a seat," he said, though his mind was racing with questions. He had no idea what had brought her to his office, but he was determined to remain calm and hear her out. Karen sat down slowly, glancing at Mark with a mix of guilt and uncertainty. She seemed different than he remembered, less sure of herself. She seemed out of place in his sleek office, with its polished floors and expensive furniture. "I know you must be wondering why I'm here," she continued, her voice quiet. "I just wanted to apologize for what I said to you in the park. I didn't know who you were, and what I said was cruel and thoughtless." Mark remained silent for a moment, studying her. He had never expected to see her again, let alone hear an apology. He had already moved on from the encounter, but there was something about her tone that made him want to listen. Maybe she was genuine, or maybe she was just trying to get out of an uncomfortable situation. Either way, he decided to hear her out. "It's all right," Mark said finally. "You didn't know who I was, and I'm used to people making assumptions. But what you said, well, it wasn't right. I'm sure you understand that now." Karen nodded, looking down at her hands. "I do. I really do. I've been going through some things lately, and I guess I took my frustration out on you." Mark raised an eyebrow. He was curious, but he didn't want to push her too hard. "What kind of things?" he asked, his tone gentle but interested. Karen hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I've been struggling a lot with my own life. My job, my relationships, everything just feels like it's falling apart. And I guess I lashed out at you because I was jealous." Mark frowned slightly. He hadn't expected this kind of explanation. "Jealous?" he repeated. "Yes," she admitted. "I know it sounds strange, but I envy your life. Your confidence, your success. I always thought people in wheelchairs were weak or helpless, but then I saw you in the park, and it made me realize how wrong I was. You were in control. You weren't begging for anyone's pity. And honestly, I didn't know how to handle it. I didn't know how someone like you could have everything together while people like me, well, we struggled just to get by." Mark was taken aback. He had never expected Karen to open up like this. It was rare for someone to admit their mistakes so openly, and even rarer for them to be this vulnerable. "I'm sorry," Karen said again, her voice almost a whisper. "I was wrong about you. I see that now." Mark leaned back in his chair, processing what she had said. He wasn't sure what to make of it all. On the one hand, he appreciated her honesty. On the other hand, it didn't change what had happened in the park. Still, he decided to give her the benefit of the doubt. People made mistakes, and Karen had clearly learned something from hers. He wasn't going to hold a grudge against her, especially since she had come to him and admitted her fault. "It's good that you realized it," Mark said after a moment. "But I hope you'll take this lesson and share it with others. People shouldn't be judged by what they look like or what they have. You never know who someone truly is until you take the time to get to know them." Karen nodded, her eyes filled with sincerity. "I will. I promise." Mark smiled slightly. "Good. I hope we can both learn from this." As Karen stood to leave, Mark couldn't help but wonder how this unexpected meeting would play out. He wasn't sure if he had forgiven her completely, but he was willing to give her a chance. After all, everyone deserved the opportunity to change. And as Karen walked out of his office, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was just the beginning. Something told him that their paths would cross again. And when they did, Karen would be in for an even bigger surprise. The invitation. Days passed after Karen's visit to Mark's office. He couldn't quite shake the memory of their conversation. While he had been surprised by her apology, something about it still left him feeling uneasy. Was her remorse genuine, or had she simply come to realize that she had messed with the wrong person? Mark returned to his usual routine, focusing on his business and keeping a low profile. He didn't want to make a big deal out of what had happened. After all, Karen was just one person in a sea of people who didn't truly understand him. But something kept tugging at his mind, making him wonder if there was more to her than just the arrogant woman he had met in the park. One afternoon, as he was wrapping up a meeting with his executive team, Lisa, his assistant, approached his desk with a letter in her hand. "Mr. Taylor," she said, her voice filled with a hint of curiosity. "This just came for you. It's from a Karen Foster." Mark raised an eyebrow. He hadn't expected to hear from her again so soon. "Thank you, Lisa," he said, taking the letter from her. He opened it carefully, his fingers brushing against the thick paper. It was a formal invitation. "Dear Mr. Taylor," the letter began, "I hope this message finds you well. I am writing to extend an invitation to you to join me at a charity gala I'm hosting next week. It would be an honor to have you attend, and I would love to personally show you my appreciation for the kindness you showed me during our recent encounter. Please consider this as a gesture of goodwill and a chance to make amends for my past behavior." The letter went on to include the details of the event, a fancy charity gala to raise funds for underprivileged children. Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of irony. Karen, the woman who had once looked down on him, was now inviting him to her event, asking for forgiveness. He wasn't sure how to respond. Part of him wanted to ignore the invitation, to simply let it go and move on. But another part of him wondered what her real intentions were. Was this just another attempt to gain favor, or was it a sincere act of kindness? Either way, Mark knew he had nothing to lose by attending. If anything, it would give him a chance to observe Karen in a different light. "Lisa," Mark said, looking up at his assistant, "I'll attend the gala. Make the arrangements." Lisa blinked in surprise. "You sure, sir? I mean, after everything that happened." "Yes," Mark interrupted, his tone firm. "Make the arrangements. I'm curious to see what kind of person she really is." Later that week, Mark found himself at the entrance of a grand ballroom, the venue for Karen's charity gala. It was exactly as he had expected, elegant, extravagant, and filled with wealthy, well-dressed people. The chandeliers sparkled overhead, and the hum of polite conversation filled the air. Mark felt a bit out of place among the crowd, but he was used to that feeling. He had never been one for the spotlight, preferring to keep his private life out of the public eye. As he stepped into the ballroom, a familiar face appeared, Karen. She looked completely different than the woman he had met at the park. Gone were the scornful eyes and the smug attitude. In her place was a woman dressed in an elegant black gown, her hair styled to perfection. She looked every bit the part of a sophisticated charity organizer, but there was something in her eyes, a hint of nervousness, that Mark hadn't expected. "Mr. Taylor," she said, her voice warm but slightly hesitant, "I'm so glad you could make it. Thank you for coming." Mark gave her a small smile, his tone polite. "Of course. Thank you for the invitation." Karen led him through the crowd, introducing him to a few key figures at the event. It was clear she was trying to make a good impression on him. But Mark wasn't fooled. He could sense that this was a woman who still had something to prove. As the evening went on, Mark began to observe her more closely. Karen was charming, attentive, and, surprisingly, quite genuine in her interactions with others. She had clearly put a lot of effort into making this event a success, and it was working. People seemed to gravitate toward her, drawn in by her kindness and sincerity. But as Mark watched her, he couldn't help but wonder, was this the real Karen? Or was it all just a well-crafted act to cover up her past mistakes? His thoughts were interrupted when Karen returned to him with a glass of champagne. "I'm so glad you came," she said again, her smile brighter this time. "I know it's been a little awkward between us, but I wanted to show you that I'm not the person I was in the park. I've changed, and I hope tonight will prove that." Mark took a sip of the champagne, considering her words. There was no doubt that Karen had made a strong impression on him that night, but he still wasn't sure what to think. He wasn't in the business of trusting people easily, especially those who had shown their true colors before. "I appreciate the gesture," Mark said carefully, "but actions speak louder than words. Let's see if tonight's event is a step in the right direction." Karen's expression faltered for a brief moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "You'll see," she said softly. "I promise you, I'm not the same person anymore." Mark nodded, but deep down, he couldn't help but feel the weight of uncertainty. Was Karen truly a changed woman, or was this just another layer of deception? As the evening wore on, the tension between them remained. Mark wasn't ready to forgive her completely, but he couldn't deny that something about the night intrigued him. He knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the last time their paths would cross. And whatever happened next, Karen was about to face a surprising revelation of her own, the unlikely bond. As the evening progressed, Mark couldn't help but watch Karen more closely. She seemed to be genuinely engaging with the people around her, her charm and grace drawing attention. But something about it didn't sit right with him. Was this really who she was, or was it just a mask she wore for these kinds of events? Despite his skepticism, Mark found himself feeling a strange sense of curiosity. Maybe Karen was trying to change, maybe she wasn't, but there was one thing he knew for sure. He was no longer the man she had once dismissed in the park. The power dynamic had shifted, and now he held the cards. Karen made her way back to him after a conversation with a wealthy donor, a look of relief on her face as she approached. "Mark," she said, her voice warmer now, less hesitant than before, "I'm so glad you're still here. I know I've probably made some mistakes in the past, but tonight, I want to make things right. Not just with you, but with everyone I've ever hurt." Her eyes were sincere, but Mark remained unsure. "You can't erase the past," Mark replied quietly, his gaze steady. "But you can show whether or not you're truly changed." Karen nodded slowly, as if taking in his words. She was clearly trying to prove herself, but the question was, would her actions match her promises? As the night went on, the gala became more crowded, and Mark began to feel the weight of the social atmosphere. People mingled around him, but he wasn't interested in superficial conversations. He was here for one reason: to find out who Karen really was. It wasn't until late in the evening, just before the auction portion of the event began, that Mark had a chance to talk to Karen alone. She had excused herself from the crowd and approached him cautiously, as though she wasn't entirely sure how to broach the topic she had in mind. "Mark," Karen began, her voice lowering a bit, "I wanted to ask you something. Something personal." Mark raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. "Go ahead." Karen hesitated for a moment before speaking again. I know that I haven't exactly earned your trust, and I understand why. But I've been thinking about what you said, about showing my true self. And I want to do something to prove to you that I'm not the person I used to be. Mark didn't say anything immediately, simply waiting for her to continue. I want to share something with you, she went on. Something very few people know. Karen's expression softened, and there was a vulnerability in her eyes that Mark hadn't noticed before. I used to be one of those people who thought money was everything. But I've learned, the hard way, that it's not. It's relationships, it's kindness, it's understanding. And I want to show you that. Mark felt a flicker of something. Was it sincerity? He didn't know for sure, but he found himself listening more intently now. What do you mean? Mark asked cautiously, still unsure if she was playing some game. I've been involved in a project, Karen continued, her voice gaining strength. A community initiative to help those in need, to give back to the people I once looked down upon. I've been working with local shelters and outreach programs. I'm not doing this for recognition. I'm doing this because I want to make a real difference, and I want you to see that I'm serious about change. Mark took a moment to process her words. Could this really be the same woman who had dismissed him just weeks ago? Could she really have changed so much? I'll believe it when I see it, Mark replied, keeping his tone even. Actions, Karen. Actions speak louder than words. Karen smiled faintly, a hint of relief in her expression. I understand, and I'm willing to prove it to you. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance. Just one chance. Mark wasn't sure if he was ready to give her that chance, but there was something compelling about the way she spoke. Something different about her tonight. Maybe she was being honest. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for redemption. You've got one chance, Mark said, his voice firm. But don't expect me to trust you immediately. I wouldn't ask you to, Karen responded with quiet determination. But I'll work for it, every day. And I'll show you that I'm not the woman you once met in the park. Before Mark could respond, the auction began, and Karen's attention was pulled back to the event. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that things were shifting. There was something about the way she had spoken, about the sincerity in her eyes, that made him wonder if maybe, just maybe, Karen had truly changed. As the evening came to a close, Mark was left with more questions than answers. Was this woman truly different? Had she really changed her outlook on life? Or was this just another facade? Only time would tell. But for the first time, Mark felt a tiny spark of hope. Maybe this night would be the beginning of a new chapter, not just for Karen, but for him as well. The revelation. The days following the gala were quiet, but Mark couldn't shake the thoughts of Karen from his mind. Had she really changed, or was she just putting on another act? She had made an effort to reach out to him several times, each time offering to show him the project she had been working on. Her sincerity seemed to shine through, but Mark wasn't ready to completely let his guard down. He had been hurt before and wasn't willing to make the same mistake again. A week after their conversation at the gala, Mark found himself walking down the street when his phone buzzed. It was a message from Karen. He hesitated for a moment, wondering what she wanted now. Finally, curiosity got the best of him, and he opened the message. Mark, I have something to show you. I think it might change everything. Please meet me at the community center this afternoon. Mark's brow furrowed. Something about the message felt urgent, as if she was asking him to trust her in a way she hadn't before. He thought about it for a moment. Was this another attempt at redemption, or was he being drawn into another one of her games? Despite his hesitation, Mark decided to go. He had promised to give her a chance, and he wasn't one to back out so easily. So he made his way to the address Karen had given him. When Mark arrived at the community center, he was surprised by how quiet it was. The place looked almost empty, with only a few cars parked outside. As he walked through the front doors, he noticed Karen standing by a table, sorting through a stack of papers. She looked up as she heard his footsteps, and her face brightened. Mark, thank you for coming, she said, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and excitement. "I wasn't sure if you would actually show up." "I said I'd give you a chance," Mark replied, his tone cautious. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he was willing to hear her out. "I've been working on this project for months," Karen said as she gestured to the papers on the table. "This isn't just about donating money or showing up for an event. This is about real change. We've started a program that provides training and resources for people who are struggling, especially those from communities I used to ignore." Mark took a step closer, his interest piqued. He glanced over the papers, which contained detailed plans for job training programs, educational resources, and mental health support. This wasn't just charity. It was a comprehensive effort to help people rebuild their lives. "I've worked with several local businesses to get them involved," Karen continued. "Some of them have already pledged funding. I've even partnered with some tech companies to offer scholarships for people to learn new skills and find work in fields they never thought possible. This is my way of giving back." Mark looked at her, taking in the depth of what she was saying. This wasn't the woman who had once mocked him for being poor, for being different. This wasn't the woman who had looked down on people who struggled. This was someone else entirely. I didn't expect this," Mark said quietly. He was trying to process everything. Karen wasn't just talking the talk. She was walking the walk. The woman who had once been so focused on wealth and status was now dedicating her time and resources to helping others who had nothing. "I know I can't erase my past," Karen said, her voice tinged with regret. "But I want to show you that I'm more than the person I was. I'm not just trying to prove something to you, Mark. I'm trying to prove it to myself. I want to be better." Mark's mind raced. Was this really happening? Could someone change this much? The woman who had been so dismissive, so focused on herself, had transformed into someone who was working tirelessly to improve the lives of others. He had heard people say that people could change, but to see it with his own eyes was something else entirely. Karen smiled, a little nervously, as she watched Mark process what she had just revealed. "I already started working with a few families, offering them training and job opportunities. Some of them have already been hired. I know it's just the beginning, but I'm seeing real results, and I want you to see that too." Mark stood there, silently absorbing everything Karen had said. He had come here expecting to be disappointed, expecting to see more of the same. But instead, he was faced with a woman who had done the hard work of change, who had truly transformed her mindset and her actions. "I can see you're serious about this," Mark said slowly. "And I can't deny that what you're doing is important. It's real change, not just a Band-Aid fix." Karen's eyes sparkled with gratitude. "Thank you, Mark. That means more than you know." As Mark looked around the community center, he realized that this wasn't just about Karen proving herself to him anymore. It was about her proving herself to the world. And, in a way, to herself. "I'm proud of you," Mark said, surprising himself with the words. It wasn't easy to admit, but he couldn't ignore the truth. Karen had changed. She had shown him that people could learn, grow, and redeem themselves. "I know it's just the beginning," Karen said softly. "But I want you to be a part of it. I want you to see how much of a difference we can make together." For the first time in a long while, Mark felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he had misjudged Karen. Maybe this was the start of something beautiful, something that neither of them had expected. And as he left the community center that day, Mark couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one full of unexpected revelations and the power of redemption. A second chance. Over the next few weeks, Mark began to spend more time with Karen, getting involved in her projects and seeing firsthand the work she was putting in. She wasn't just talking about making a difference, she was living it. The community programs were growing, and the people involved were starting to see real changes in their lives. Mark had never seen Karen so dedicated, so focused, and so driven to help others. One afternoon, as Mark was helping her organize some files at the community center, Karen spoke up. "I've been thinking a lot about us, Mark," she said, her voice tentative. "About what happened between us before, and everything that's happened since." Mark stopped what he was doing and looked at her. He could tell that she was serious, and there was a vulnerability in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. "What do you mean?" he asked, setting the papers down and giving her his full attention. "I know I hurt you," Karen continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can never take back the things I said and did. But I need you to know that I've changed. I've learned so much, not just about the world, but about myself. And I'm sorry. I've always been so focused on the wrong things: status, money, appearances. But I see now that there's so much more to life than that." Mark's heart softened as he listened. He had spent so much time holding on to the past, holding on to the way Karen had treated him, that he hadn't allowed himself to see the woman she had become. And now, here she was, opening up to him in a way she never had before. "I appreciate you saying that, Karen," Mark replied, his voice sincere. "I've seen the changes in you. It's hard to believe it at times, but I'm starting to see that you really have turned a corner. You're doing more than just talking. You're acting. You're making a real difference." Karen smiled, the weight of the past still hanging between them, but slowly lifting. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I want you to know that I'm not the same person I was. And I hope one day you'll believe that." Mark nodded slowly. "I do believe it, Karen. I've seen enough to know that you've changed, but trust takes time. I'm willing to give it, though. I'm willing to see where this goes." The air between them shifted, and for the first time in a long time, there was a sense of possibility. Mark had been hesitant to trust Karen again, to let go of the hurt and disappointment he had felt in the past. But now, standing in front of him was a woman who had truly turned her life around. A woman who was no longer defined by her past mistakes, but by the actions she was taking in the present. As the weeks went by, Mark and Karen continued to work together, and their connection grew stronger. They spent time talking, laughing, and learning from each other. Mark could see how deeply Karen cared about the people she was helping, and how much she was invested in making sure they had the resources and support they needed to succeed. She was no longer the selfish, entitled woman who had once dismissed him. She had become someone who truly understood the value of compassion, empathy, and community. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the community center, watching the sunset, Karen turned to Mark. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice soft. "I know things haven't been easy for us, and I understand if you're not ready for this, but I want to ask you something important." Mark raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Karen took a deep breath, her eyes searching his face for any sign of hesitation. "Would you consider giving us a real chance, not just as partners in this project, but as something more?" Mark felt his heart skip a beat. This wasn't what he had expected to hear, but as he looked at Karen, he realized that he wasn't as guarded as he once was. He had seen the way she had changed, and he had started to care for her in a way he hadn't allowed himself to before. "I don't know, Karen," he said honestly. "This is all so new. I don't know if I'm ready for that." Karen nodded, her eyes glistening with understanding. "I get it. I don't want to rush anything, but I just had to ask. I know it's a big step, and I'm not expecting anything to happen overnight, but I wanted to know where you stand." Mark took a moment, his mind racing. He had spent so much time holding on to the past, so much time thinking about the woman who had hurt him. But now he saw something different in front of him. He saw someone who was genuinely trying to make amends, someone who had worked hard to change. And he saw someone he had grown to care about deeply. "I'm not sure where this is going," Mark said finally, "but I'm willing to see where it leads. I'm willing to give us a chance, if you are." Karen smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached her eyes. "I am. I really am." In that moment, Mark realized that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would still be challenges, still be moments of doubt. But he also knew that they had both come a long way from where they had started. And together, they could face whatever came their way. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark and Karen sat in silence, their hearts full of hope for the future. They didn't have all the answers, but they were willing to find them together. And for the first time in a long time, Mark felt that maybe, just maybe, he had found something worth fighting for. The ultimate surprise. A few months had passed since Mark and Karen had begun to rebuild their relationship. The trust that had once seemed so fragile was now growing stronger with each day. Mark had continued to be involved in Karen's community projects, and it was clear to him that she was committed to making a real change. She was no longer the woman who cared only for herself, but someone who poured her heart into helping others. One day, as they worked side by side in the community center, Karen seemed unusually quiet. She was focused on her work, but Mark could tell something was on her mind. He set down his papers and looked at her. "Karen, is everything okay?" he asked gently. "You've been distant lately. You know you can talk to me, right?" Karen looked up, a small smile playing on her lips, but there was something in her eyes that Mark couldn't quite place. It was a mix of excitement and uncertainty. "I've been thinking about something," she said, taking a deep breath. "Something that might change everything for us." Mark raised an eyebrow, intrigued, but also cautious. "What is it?" Karen stood up and walked over to her desk, pulling out an envelope. She handed it to Mark with a slight tremor in her hand. "I got this today. It's a letter from my lawyer. It's about the inheritance I told you about." Mark took the envelope, his heart racing as he opened it. Inside was a letter that explained in great detail the contents of the inheritance Karen had mentioned in passing before. As he read, his eyes widened. It wasn't just a small amount of money as Karen had once thought. It was a vast fortune, worth millions. The letter explained that her late uncle, a wealthy businessman, had left her the full inheritance, along with the rights to a multi-million-dollar estate. It was a shock, and Mark couldn't believe what he was reading. "But I don't understand," Mark said, looking up at Karen in disbelief. "You didn't mention this before. Why didn't you tell me about it?" Karen looked down, her expression filled with uncertainty. "I didn't know how to bring it up. I didn't want you to think I was using you for my money. I didn't want to go back to the person I used to be, the one who cared only about status and wealth." Mark's heart softened as he listened. Karen had changed so much in such a short time. She had struggled with her past, trying to distance herself from the woman who had once been obsessed with wealth and appearances. But now, standing in front of him, she was someone completely different, someone who had learned to value people over material things. "I'm not sure what to do with all of this," Karen continued, her voice filled with uncertainty. "I never asked for this inheritance. I don't want it to change who I am or what I've been trying to do here." Mark reached out, taking her hand gently. "Karen, I don't think this will change who you are. It's just another opportunity to help others, to continue what you've been doing. You've worked so hard to get to where you are now. You don't need to feel guilty about it." Karen looked into his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, she seemed at peace with herself. "You're right. I can use this to make an even bigger impact. It's not about the money. It's about the people I can help. I want to do something meaningful with it." Mark smiled. "Then do it. Use this opportunity to make a real difference. And I'll be here, supporting you every step of the way." Karen's face lit up with a mixture of relief and excitement. "Thank you, Mark. I don't think I could do this without you." Over the next few weeks, Karen made plans to use her newfound wealth to further her community projects. She wanted to create scholarships, build better housing for low-income families, and establish a foundation for young women to pursue their dreams. It was clear to Mark that Karen was not letting the money define her, but instead using it as a tool to continue her work and make the world a better place. As they continued to work together, Mark began to see Karen in a new light. She was no longer the woman who had once turned her back on him, the woman who had only cared about appearances. She had truly transformed into someone who wanted to leave a lasting impact on the world, someone who was willing to use her resources to help others. One evening, as they sat together in the community center, Mark turned to Karen with a smile. "You know, I think I'm starting to fall for you all over again." Karen laughed softly, her eyes shining with warmth. "I think I might be falling for you too." They shared a quiet moment, the weight of the past finally lifting. Mark had learned to trust Karen again, and Karen had learned that true happiness came not from wealth, but from the connections and impact one made in the world. Together, they had found something worth building, something real. As they looked ahead, neither of them knew exactly what the future held, but they knew that whatever came their way, they would face it together. And that, Mark realized, was the greatest gift of all.